Girl in coma for 6 years, suddenly pregnant. DNA test shocks everyone. Rain poured down the cracked windshield of Alice's old pickup truck, and she hummed along to a country song, her voice soft. Her fingers tapped the steering wheel, her nails chipped from a long day at the pet store, where she'd spent hours caring for a timid dog. "You'll be someone's miracle," she whispered to the dog. Her breath misted in the cold air, and now as she drove the winding road home, she imagined her own rescue, a barn full of wagging dogs. Headlights flashed in her rearview mirror, sudden and blinding, and she squinted, adjusting. They were too close, going too fast. But before she could curse the reckless driver, the world exploded in a deafening crash of metal and glass. Her body lurched forward, hitting her head on the glass, then falling into the seat, the radio going silent as rain seeped through the broken window, pooling around her still hands. In the light of Mercy General, Abigail sat by the familiar bed, her calloused fingers tracing the edges of a faded photograph. It was Alice at 22, her hair tousled, her smile bright, and Abigail's chest tightened as she remembered that day. The summer heat, the smell of grass, a daughter with ambitions, dreams. "I was always after something," she murmured, her voice hoarse from years of shouting orders in army barracks, though now her voice was barely a whisper over the hum of machinery. The beeping of the heart monitor filled the room, steady but hollow, and she glanced at the girl lying there, pale, fragile, a stranger in her own body since the accident 6 years ago. Abigail's hands shook, not from age but from the weight of holding it, and she tucked the photo back into her coat, where her daughter had lain since that night. Roy stood in the doorway, his broad shoulders slumped, and Leo's leash dangled from his hand, the dog's ears flat, as if he sensed the sadness in the room. "I think I'll bring him over," Roy said, his voice low and hoarse from too many cigarettes and too few words. He didn't move closer, just lingered there, his muddy boots leaving faint tracks on the tile. Abigail nodded, her eyes flicking to Leo, who stepped forward and sniffed the air near Alice's hand, then lay back with a soft groan. "He'll miss Mrs. her," Roy added, stuffing his hands in his pockets, and there was something on his face. Pain, maybe, or the ghost of the promise he'd made to Alice years ago when they'd sat on her porch and talked about fixing the world one dog at a time. "She'll hate this," Abigail said, her gaze locked on Alice's closed eyes, and she leaned forward, elbows on her knees. "All these tubes, this silence. She'll be out there making a scene, pulling a mongrel out of a ditch." Her lips twitched, not quite a smile, and Roy growled in agreement, his breath coming in short gasps as he watched Leo nudge Alice's finger, waiting for an answer that never came. "Still possible," he answered, though the words were heavy, uncertain, and he shifted his weight, the squeak of his boots echoing in the silence. "She's stronger than she looks, she always is." He didn't elaborate, didn't need to. They'd had this conversation 100 times, each version a little older, a little less hopeful. Abigail straightened, her spine as stiff as if facing a drill sergeant, and she brushed a lock of silver hair from her face, her fingers lingering there as if for balance. 6 years, she said, and it wasn't a question, just a fact that lay between them, sharp and unshakable. 6 years, and I still hear that damn crash in my sleep. Metal on metal, she screamed. She paused, her throat working, and Roy looked away, out the window where the rain rolled down the glass like tears. "I kept thinking if I'd made her stay home that night, if I'd fixed that truck myself." "Don't do that," Roy interrupted, his voice harder now, and he stepped closer, Leo following. "It wasn't your fault, Abigail. It wasn't anyone's fault but the bastard who stabbed her." He clenched his jaw, his eyes dark with a rage he rarely showed, and Abigail returned his gaze, admitting that she had softened enough for him to step in. "Maybe," she admitted, though her tone suggested she didn't believe it, and she reached for the photo again, clutching it like a lifeline. "But I have to protect her, Roy. That's what mothers do." Her voice broke, just for a moment, and she pressed her lips together, swallowing the sob that threatened to escape. Roy knelt beside Leo, his hand on the dog's head, and he looked at Aliceel, but she heard the plea in his voice, the plea she had clung to every sleepless night. The rain outside had thinned to a drizzle, tapping the windows in a sad rhythm, and the room felt smaller, the air thick with unspoken promises. Abigail leaned back in her chair, her hands clasped in her lap, sighing, shaking, her eyes never leaving Alice. "Yes," she whispered, though it was more to Roy than to her, and the beeping of the monitor lingered, a thin thread connecting them to a girl who had once lit up their world. In that moment, they sat together, Abigail with her soldierly resolve, Roy with his quiet faith, and Leo with his unwavering loyalty, and the storm outside dissipated, leaving only one person inside, who had never really left. A sparrow perches on the ledge outside Mercy General, its feathers ruffled by a restless March breeze. Inside, the air smells of antiseptic and stale coffee, a quiet hum threading through the corridors. Abigail Foster shifts in the hard plastic chair beside Alice's bed, her knees creaking from years of marching and mending soldiers, and she opens a worn leather journal, its pages yellowed and curling at the edges. March 10th, 2018, she reads, her voice a low rasp thick with the weight of time. Found a mutt behind the gas station today, half-starved, one ear torn, but Alice wouldn't leave him. Her fingers linger on the faded ink, tracing Alice's looping scrawl, and she glances at the girl lying still under the thin hospital blanket, her face as pale as the walls, untouched by the 6 years that have carved lines into Abigail's own. "You named him Rusty," she continues, her eyes glistening but unyielding. "Said he'd be somebody's shadow one day, following them home." The words catch in her throat, and she pauses, her breath slow and deliberate, as if she's rationing it for the years ahead. The door creaks open, and Roy steps in, his work boots leaving faint smears of mud on the tile, while Leo pads beside him, his nails clicking softly. "Spring's kicking up out there," he says. His tone gruff but warm, and he brushes a hand through his graying hair, dislodging a few damp strands. He carries a small wooden carving, a dog with a cocked head, whittled smooth, and sets it on the bedside table among a dozen others, each one a silent tribute to Alice's dreams. Leo sniffs the air, then settles near the bed, his muzzle resting on his paws, and Roy watches him, his broad hands flexing as if they miss the feel of a chisel. "Figured she'd want to see this one," he adds, nodding toward the carving, and there's a flicker of pride in his eyes, tempered by the ache that settled there over time. Abigail closes the journal, her movements precise, almost military, and she leans back, her gaze drifting to the window where sunlight spills through, catching dust motes in a slow, swirling dance. "She'd tell you it's got too much tail," she says, her lips twitching faintly, and she adjusts her coat, the same one she wore in '72, its buttons dull but steadfast. "Always said your dogs look too happy to be real." Her voice carries a trace of a laugh, dry and fleeting, and she folds her hands in her lap, her knuckles whitening as she grips them tight. Roy grunts, a sound that's half agreement, half defiance, and he pulls up a chair, the legs scraping against the floor. "Maybe they are," he replies, settling in with a sigh, and he scratches Leo's ears, the dog's tail thumping once, then stilling. "But she'd keep it anyway. Probably put it on that shelf she never got around to building." He looks at Alice, her chest rising and falling with the rhythm of the machines, and his jaw tightens, though his eyes soften, holding a memory of late nights in her cluttered apartment, plotting a rescue that never came. "She was stubborn about that shelf," Abigail says, her tone shifting, softer now, and she tilts her head, studying the carvings lined up like sentinels. "Kept saying she'd do it herself, didn't need anyone's help, not even yours." She meets Roy's gaze, and there's a quiet understanding there, forged through years of waiting, of hoping against the silence that swallowed Alice whole. "Guess she got that from me," she adds, and her fingers brush the journal again. A tether to a life that feels further away with every passing day. Roy leans forward, his elbows on his knees, and he watches Leo, who lifts his head, ears twitching at some distant sound. "You think she hears us?" he asks, his voice low, almost lost in the hum of the ventilator, and he doesn't look up, as if the question might break if he does. "All this talking, these stories, think it gets through?" His hands clench, then relax, and he stares at the carving, its wooden eyes glinting in the light. Abigail doesn't answer right away. She lets the question hang, heavy and fragile, and she shifts her gaze to Alice, to the faint freckles still visible on her cheeks, a map of a girl who once ran through fields with strays at her heels. "I don't know," she says finally, her words measured, deliberate. But I keep hoping she's in there, listening, maybe dreaming about that barn she wanted. Her voice wavers, just for a moment, and she clears her throat, sitting straighter, as if discipline can hold back the tide of doubt. If she's not, then we're just fools talking to ourselves, she adds, and there's a rawness there, a crack in her armor that Roy doesn't miss. Fools or not, Roy says, his tone steady, grounding, I'd rather talk to her than let this place stay quiet. He reaches out, hesitates, then rests a hand on Leo's back, the dog's warmth a small comfort against the cold sterility around them. She deserves that much. Someone keeping the lights on. His eyes flicker to the window where the breeze rattles the frame, and he exhales, long and slow, a man carrying more than he'll ever say. Abigail nods, a small, almost imperceptible gesture, and she opens the journal again, flipping to a new page, her fingers trembling slightly. March 15th, she begins, her voice finding its rhythm. Rusty followed me home today, and Alice laughed so hard she cried. She keeps reading, her words weaving a thread through the years, and Roy listens, his carving catching the light, while Leo's soft whimpers fill the spaces between, a fragile symphony in a room where time stands still. A lone moth flutters against the window pane of Mercy General, its wings tapping a faint, frantic rhythm in the dark. Beyond the glass, rain falls in steady sheets, a mournful drumbeat against the stillness of the night. Dr. Olivia Bennett stands by Alice Carter's bedside, her coat still damp from the walk across the parking lot, and she adjusts her glasses, the frame slipping slightly on her tired face. Late shifts never get easier, she mutters, her voice a soft thread in the quiet, and she reaches for the stethoscope around her neck, its cold metal a familiar weight against her palm. She moves with the precision of someone who's done this 1,000 times, pressing it gently to Alice's chest, then lower, her brow furrowing as she listens. Steady as always, she says, almost to herself, though there's a flicker of unease in her tone, and she pauses, the stethoscope lingering over Alice's abdomen, where something feels off. Too firm, too alive. You're a puzzle, aren't you? Olivia whispers, her breath catching as she steps back, and she glances at the chart hanging by the bed, its pages filled with 6 years of unchanging notes. She sets the stethoscope down, her fingers trembling just enough to notice, and she wheels the ultrasound machine closer, its hum filling the room like a low, insistent prayer. Let's see what's going on, she says, her voice steadying as she switches it on, though her eyes dart to Alice's face. Still, serene, a porcelain mask under the fluorescent light. And she wonders, not for the first time, what dreams might be trapped behind those closed lids. The screen flickers to life, and Olivia spreads gel across Alice's skin, her movements slow, deliberate, as if she's afraid to disturb something sacred. Come on now, she murmurs, guiding the probe, and the grainy image shifts, revealing shadows and shapes that shouldn't be there, not after 6 years of stillness. Her breath hitches, sharp and sudden, and she leans closer, her glasses fogging slightly as a tiny pulsing dot appears. A heartbeat, unmistakable. No, she says, the word slipping out, low and raw, and she pulls the probe back, then presses it again, as if the machine might lie, might undo what she's seen. How? Olivia asks, her voice barely above a whisper, and she steps away, her hands shaking as she grips the edge of the cart, the room's harsh light casting jagged shadows across her face. She stares at Alice, at the rise and fall of her chest, and feels a pang of dread coil tight in her stomach, a doctor's instinct warring with a woman's grief. You've been here all this time, she says, her tone cracking. And someone did this? She doesn't finish the thought, can't, and she turns to the window where rain taps like a metronome, steady and relentless, mirroring the pulse on the screen. She sinks into a chair, her coat rustling, and she rests her head in her hands, her fingers pressing against her temples, as if to hold back the flood of questions. 6 years, she says, louder now, though it's still just her and Alice in the room. 6 years, and I've checked you every week. How did I miss this? Her voice trembles, guilt threading through it, and she lifts her head, her gaze settling on the ultrasound screen where the flicker persists. A life no one could have foreseen. I should have known, she adds, softer, and she reaches for her phone, then stops, her hand hovering as she wrestles with what comes next. Who do I even tell? Olivia asks, her words hanging in the air, and she stands again, pacing to the foot of the bed, her shoes squeaking faintly on the tile. Abigail, she'll break when she hears this, she says, picturing the older woman's stern face crumbling. And Roy, he'll want answers I don't have. She stops, her hands clenching into fists, and she looks at Alice, her voice dropping to a near whisper. You didn't deserve this, whatever this is. There's a fierceness there, a promise unspoken, and she adjusts the blanket over Alice's legs, her touch gentle but resolute. The door creaks, and a janitor's cart rattles past in the hall, its wheels a distant echo. But Olivia doesn't turn. She keeps her eyes on Alice, on the curve of her abdomen now visible beneath the blanket. I'll figure it out, she says, her tone hardening, though her hands still shake as she picks up the ultrasound wand again, needing to be sure, needing to believe. Someone's responsible, and I'll be damned if they get away with it, she adds, and she runs the probe once more, the flickering heartbeat filling the screen, a silent cry in a room that's held only silence for too long. She sets the wand down, her breath steadying, and she pulls a notepad from her pocket, jotting a quick note. 7 months, maybe 8? Her pen scratching against the paper. This changes everything, she says, her voice firm now, and she glances at the clock, its hands ticking past midnight, a reminder of how alone she is with this secret. I'll start with the logs tomorrow, she tells Alice, as if the girl might hear, might answer. Every nurse, every visitor will find out who. She adjusts her glasses, her reflections sharp in the window, and she feels the weight of it settle on her shoulders. Not just a doctor's duty, but something deeper, something personal. The rain outside slows, its rhythm faltering, and Olivia lingers by the bed, her hand resting on the rail, her gaze fixed on Alice's peaceful face. You're not alone in this, she says, quiet but certain, and the machines beep on, a steady pulse beneath the storm's fading song. A fluorescent bulb flickers in the ceiling of Mercy General's staff lounge, casting a stuttering glow over the worn linoleum. Beyond the walls, the faint hum of a vending machine buzzes, a solitary sound in the early morning hush. Margaret Cole stands by the coffee pot, her grey hair pulled tight into a bun, and she grips a clipboard, her knuckles whitening as she stares at the roster. 7 months, she says, her voice sharp, cutting through the murmur of the room. 7 months, and not one of us saw it? She slams the clipboard onto the counter, the crack echoing like a gunshot, and the nurses clustered around the table flinch, their coffee cups trembling in their hands. We've got a girl lying there, defenseless, and this happens under our noses, she adds, her lips tightening into a thin line, and she turns, her eyes scanning the faces, some averted, some wide with shock, as if searching for guilt in their silence. Ethan Harper shifts in his seat, his fingers fumbling with his badge, and he keeps his head down, the plastic ID twisting in his grip. I don't get it, he stammers, his voice barely above a whisper. I mean, we're in here every day, checking vitals, changing sheets. How does something like this slip by? He glances up, then away, his ears reddening, and he tugs at his collar, the fabric damp with nervous sweat. It's not like we weren't paying attention, he adds, though the words sound hollow, a plea more than a defense, and he shrinks back, avoiding Margaret's piercing stare. Olivia Bennett paces near the window, her coat swishing with each step, and she stops, her hands on her hips as she turns to face them. It didn't slip by, she says, her tone firm but laced with exhaustion. Someone made sure we didn't see. Someone who knew how to cover their tracks. She adjusts her glasses, her fingers lingering on the frames, and she looks out at the hallway where shadows stretch long and thin under the flickering lights. I checked the logs last night, she continues, her voice dropping, and there's gaps, nights with no record of who came in or out. Her words hang heavy, and she crosses her arms, her gaze settling on Margaret, a silent question passing between them. Who's got access to those logs? Margaret asks, her eyes narrowing, and she steps closer to Olivia, her posture rigid, a general marshalling her troops. You're saying this wasn't an accident, that someone's been playing us? Her tone hardens, fury simmering beneath the surface, and she taps the clipboard with a finger, the sound sharp and insistent. I've been here 20 years, Olivia, she adds, her voice rising slightly. And I'll be damned if I let this place turn into some kind of hunting ground. She stops, her breath catching, and she presses a hand to her chest as if to steady the anger threatening to spill over. Ethan looks up, his badge slipping from his fingers to the table, and he shakes his head, his voice trembling. "But who'd do that?" he asks, his eyes darting between them. "I mean, we all know Alice. She's been here forever. She's one of ours." He leans forward, his elbows on the table, and he swallows hard, his Adam's apple bobbing. "It's got to be a mistake. Maybe the ultrasound's wrong, maybe—" He cuts off, his words faltering under Margaret's glare, and he slumps back, defeated, his hands folding in his lap. "It's not a mistake," Olivia says, her voice cutting through his doubt, and she steps closer, her coat brushing the edge of a chair. "I ran it twice, Ethan. There's a heartbeat, clear as day, and it's been there for months." She pauses, her gaze softening as she looks at him, and she sighs, her shoulders sagging slightly. "I don't want to believe it either," she admits, quieter now. "But we've got to face it. Someone's been in that room. Someone we trusted." Her words settle like a stone, and she turns back to the window, her reflection faint against the dawn creeping in. In the hallway, Charlie Evans pushes a mop across the tile, the handle creaking under his grip, and he keeps his head down, his young face drawn tight with unease. "Heard them talking," he mutters to himself, his voice low, barely audible. "Something bad's going on. Always is in places like this." He glances toward Alice's room, where Roy kneels beside Leo, the dog's fur bristling as a shadow passes. Tyler Grayson, his polished shoes clicking with purpose, his smile sharp and fleeting. "Who's that guy?" Charlie whispers, pausing his mop, and he watches Tyler disappear around a corner, a chill creeping up his spine. Back in the lounge, Margaret picks up the clipboard, her fingers steady now, and she looks at Olivia, her tone resolute. "We start with the staff," she says, her voice a command. "Every nurse, every orderly, anyone who set foot near her." She taps the paper again, her eyes blazing, and she nods, as if sealing a pact. "And we don't breathe a word to Abigail or Roy, not yet," she adds, her voice softening. "They've carried enough. This'll break them if we're not careful." She sets the clipboard down, gentler this time, and she straightens, her authority unshaken. Olivia nods, her coat swishing as she turns, and she meets Margaret's gaze, a flicker of resolve passing between them. "I'll pull the security tapes," she says, her tone steady. "See if there's anything left, anything we can use." She adjusts her glasses again, her fingers firm, and she glances at Ethan, who's still fidgeting, his badge now abandoned on the table. "You're with me," she tells him, her voice gentle but firm. "We're in this together now." She heads for the door, her steps slow but purposeful, and Ethan follows, his reluctance trailing behind him like a shadow. Margaret watches them go, her hands folding behind her back, and she mutters under her breath, "Whoever you are, you picked the wrong hospital." The room falls quiet, the coffee cooling in forgotten cups, and the whispers linger, threading through the corridors like a warning no one dares to voice. A thin mist clings to the asphalt of Mercy General's parking lot, curling around the rusted edges of a dumpster. Overhead, a street lamp buzzes, its light pooling in shallow puddles left by the morning's rain. Roy trudges across the lot, his boots crunching on gravel, and he tugs Leo's leash gently, the dog's nose twitching as it skims the damp ground. "Easy, boy," he says, his voice a low rumble, though there's a tightness in it, a weariness that settled deeper since Olivia's call an hour ago. Something about Alice, something wrong. Leo pulls forward, his ears pricking, and Roy lets the leash slacken, his brow furrowing as the dog freezes, hackles rising along his spine. "What you got there?" he asks, squinting into the mist, and he steps closer, his breath catching as Leo lunges, paws scrabbling at a crumpled jacket half buried under a car tire, its fabric monogrammed with a bold TT stitched in gold. "Tyler," Roy mutters, the name a bitter taste on his tongue, and he kneels, his knees creaking as he pries the jacket free, holding it up to the dim light. "You son of a... Where'd you leave this?" he asks, though the question's for no one but the wind, and he runs a hand over the embroidered initials, his fingers tracing the threads as memories flicker. Tyler's smug grin, the way he'd loom over Alice at the pet store, demanding her time, her attention. Leo growls, a low, steady sound, and Roy nods, his jaw tightening as he stands, the jacket dangling from his grip. "Yeah, I smell it too," he says, quieter now. "Something rotten. Let's get inside." He turns toward the hospital, his steps slow but purposeful, and Leo follows, his tail stiff, his eyes locked on the building ahead. Inside Alice's room, Abigail sits hunched over the bed, her coat draped over the chair, and she flips through the journal, its leather cover worn smooth from years of handling. "Where'd I leave off?" she murmurs, her voice rough, steadying herself, and she stops on a page, her fingers halting as the words leap out. "He said he'd never let me go, not ever," and I laughed. But his eyes weren't joking. "Tyler," she whispers, her breath hitching, and she grips the book, her knuckles whitening as she reads on, the ink blurring through a sudden sting in her eyes. "You wrote this a week before," she says, her tone hardening. "A week before that truck took you. Why didn't you tell me?" She leans closer to Alice, her hand hovering over the girl's still fingers, and she clenches her jaw, memories flashing. Tyler's raised voice, the way he'd slam a fist on the counter when Alice pulled away. "You should have told me," Abigail says again, louder this time, and she flips back a page, then forward, her movements sharp, searching for more. "I knew he was trouble. Saw it in Nam men like him, all charm till they're crossed," she mutters, her voice trembling with a soldier's old fury, and she stops, her eyes locking on another line. "He followed me home last night, said I'd regret leaving." "Regret," she repeats, the word a hiss, and she slams the journal shut, her hands shaking as she presses it to her chest, her breath ragged against the hum of the machines. The door swings open, and Roy steps in, Leo at his heels, the jacket clutched in his fist. "Found this out back," he says, his tone clipped, urgent, and he holds it up, the monogram glinting under the fluorescent light. Leo went straight for it, Tyler's no question. He drops it onto the chair, his hands flexing as if he wants to tear it apart, and he meets Abigail's gaze, his eyes dark with something unspoken. "He's been here," he adds, his voice dropping, "close enough to leave this behind, close enough to—" He trails off, his throat working, and he looks at Alice, at the curve of her cheek, the stillness that's held her for too long. Abigail stands, the journal falling to the bed, and she steps closer, her boots heavy on the tile as she takes the jacket, her fingers brushing the initials. "He said he'd never let her go," she says, her voice low, dangerous. "Wrote it right here. Look at this." She grabs the journal, thrusting it toward Roy, and she points to the page, her nail digging into the paper. "He was stalking her, Roy. Before the crash, after, who knows how long," she continues, her words tumbling faster now. "And now this, now her—" She stops, her hand gesturing toward Alice's abdomen, and she turns away, her shoulders hunching as she fights the sob clawing up her throat. Roy takes the journal, his hands steady despite the storm in his eyes, and he reads silently, his lips pressing into a thin line. "Bastard," he says finally, the word a growl, and he sets the book down, gentle, reverent, as if it's Alice herself. "Leo knew, out there, he smelled it, went right to that jacket," he says, nodding toward the dog, who sits alert, ears twitching at the distant bark echoing from the lot. "He's been sniffing around her, Abigail, maybe all this time," he adds, his voice softening, "and we didn't see it till now." He rubs a hand over his face, his fingers lingering on the stubble, and he sighs, long and heavy, a man carrying a guilt he won't name. "We see it now," Abigail says, her tone resolute, and she picks up the jacket again, folding it tight, her hands steadying as she finds her footing. "He's not getting away with this, not with my girl," she declares, her eyes meeting Roy's, a pact forming in the space between them. "Do you tell Olivia about this?" she asks, her voice calmer now, though the fire still burns beneath it, and she tucks the journal under her arm, her grip fierce, protective. "Not yet," Roy replies, his hand resting on Leo's head, and he straightens, his shoulders squaring as he looks toward the door. "But she needs to know. Cops too, if it comes to it," he says, his tone firm, and Leo's not done sniffing yet. He gives the dog a nod, a silent command, and Leo rises, his nose twitching, ready to hunt. Abigail nods, her gaze drifting back to Alice, and she whispers, "We're coming for you, baby. Just hold on." The room hums, the machine steady, and outside, Leo's bark fades into the mist, a promise threading through the dawn. A pigeon pecks at crumbs on the steps of the Oak Ridge police station, its feathers glinting in the weak afternoon sun. Inside, the air smells of burnt coffee and old paper, a quiet hum threading through the precinct's worn walls. Detective Lara Monroe leans over a desk piled high with files, her pen tapping a steady rhythm against a notepad, and she squints at the report in front of her, her glasses slipping down her nose. 6 years in a coma, she says, her voice calm, measured, and now this. Pregnant, no record of how or who. She adjusts her glasses, her fingers deliberate, and she glances at the officer across from her, a young man with a nervous tick in his jaw. Hospitals got gaps in their logs, she continues, her pen pausing. Nights where no one's accounted for. Someone's been sloppy or smart. Her tone stays even, a detective's detachment honed over years, and she flips a page, her eyes scanning the lines as if they might confess under her gaze. You think it's an inside job? The officer asks, his voice cracking slightly, and he shifts in his chair, his hands fidgeting with a paperclip. I mean, Mercy's small. Everyone knows everyone, he adds, bending the clip into a jagged shape. Hard to imagine one of their own doing this. He looks up, his brow creasing, and Lara tilts her head, her pen resuming its tap, a metronome to her thoughts. Doesn't have to be one of theirs, she replies, her words slow, deliberate. Could be someone with access, someone who knows the system. Money can buy a lot of blind eyes. She leans back, her chair creaking, and she taps the file with her pen, her gaze sharpening. This jacket you brought in, she says, nodding toward the evidence bag on the desk. Monogrammed, fancy, doesn't scream hospital staff to me. She pauses, her lips pursing, and she scribbles a note, her handwriting tight, precise. We'll run it for prints, fibers, see who it ties to, she adds, her voice firm. But I need you to get me names, anyone who's been near that room. At Mercy General, in the cramped security room, Margaret Cole stands before a bank of monitors, her arms crossed, and she stares at a blank screen, her lips tight with fury. Gone, she snaps, her voice slicing through the hum of the equipment. Every tape from the last 6 months, wiped clean, just like that. She turns, her grey eyes locking onto Olivia, who hovers nearby, her fingers tracing the rim of a chipped coffee mug. You're telling me this isn't suspicious? Margaret asks, her tone rising, sharp and accusing. Someone's erased our eyes, Olivia. Someone who didn't want us looking. Olivia sets the mug down, her hand steady despite the tremor in her chest, and she meets Margaret's glare, her voice low but resolute. I'm not saying it's not suspicious, she replies, her words careful. I'm saying we've got to figure out who had the keys, literally and figuratively. She steps closer, her coat brushing the edge of a chair, and she gestures toward the console, her fingers lingering in the air. Sam's working on recovery, she adds, nodding toward the tech hunched over a laptop. But whoever did this knew what they were doing, knew when we'd be too busy to notice. Her gaze softens, a flicker of exhaustion showing through, and she sighs, her breath fogging briefly in the cool room. Roy stands by the door, his arms crossed, and he shifts his weight, his boots scuffing the tile as he speaks. Leo found that jacket this morning, he says, his voice steady but his eyes stormy, out in the lot, buried under a tire. Tyler Grayson's initials stitched right on it. He unclenches his fists, his knuckles red from the cold, and he looks at Margaret, his jaw tightening. He's been here, he continues, quieter now, close enough to drop that, close enough to get to her. I'd bet my last dollar on it. He pauses, his gaze drifting to the blank screen, and he shakes his head, a slow, heavy motion. You got anything left on those tapes that can prove it? He asks, his tone edged with hope, though his face says he expects none. Margaret turns to Sam, her voice dropping to a command, and she leans over his shoulder, her shadow falling across the keys. Tell me you've got something, she says, her words clipped, urgent. Anything. A glitch, a frame, a damn shadow, I don't care. She straightens, her hands on her hips, and she waits, her breath held as Sam types, his fingers hesitant but quick. If Tyler's been waltzing in here, she adds, her tone hardening, I want his face on that screen, and I want it yesterday. Nothing yet, Sam mutters, his voice small, strained, and he pushes his glasses up. his screen reflecting a mess of code. So they didn't just wipe it, they overwrote it, layers deep, he explains, his fingers pausing. But I'm digging. Might take hours, maybe days. He glances up, his eyes meeting Margaret's, and he swallows, his Adam's apple bobbing. If there's a trace, I'll find it, he promises, though his voice wavers. Just don't hold your breath. He turns back, his shoulders hunching, and the room falls silent, the weight of his words settling like dust. Abigail stands apart near the corner, her arms wrapped around Alice's journal, and she clutches it tight, her silence louder than the chatter around her. He's laughing at us, she says finally, her voice low, cutting through the hum, and she steps forward, her boots heavy on the tile. Tyler, out there thinking he's untouchable while we're scrambling in here, she continues, her eyes blazing as she looks at Roy, then Olivia. That jacket's not enough, she adds, her tone steady, not without proof he was in her room, not without his hands on her. She stops, her breath ragged, and she presses the journal closer, her fingers digging into the leather. We'll get it, Olivia says, her voice firm, reassuring, and she moves toward Abigail, her hand hovering before resting lightly on her arm. Sam's on the tapes, Lara's got the jacket, we're closing in, Abigail, step by step, she promises, her gaze steady, and he's not as smart as he thinks. She squeezes gently, then steps back, her resolve a quiet anchor in the room's storm. Roy nods, his eyes still on the blank screen, and he mutters, Leo's nose doesn't lie. Tyler's been here and we'll nail him for it. The room hums, the tension thick, and outside the pigeon takes flight, its wings a faint whisper against the glass. A leaky pipe drips in the corner of Mercy General's basement, its steady plink echoing off concrete walls streaked with damp. Somewhere in the shadows, a rat skitters, its claws a faint scratch against the silence. Sam hunches over a flickering monitor in the hospital's tech room, his wiry frame curled tight, and he wipes sweat from his forehead, his glasses slipping as he stares at lines of code. Come on, you bastard, he mutters, his voice a shaky whisper. Give me something. Anything. His fingers fly across the keyboard, hesitant then swift, and he leans closer, his breath fogging the screen as a grainy image stutters into view. Tyler Grayson, slipping through Alice's door, his face briefly illuminated by the hall's dim light before the shadows swallow him. Got you, Sam says, his tone spiking with triumph, though his hands tremble as he saves the file, his eyes darting to the door as if expecting it to burst open. You sure that's him? Olivia asks, her voice steady but taut, and she stands behind him, her hands clasped tight, her coat still buttoned from the rush downstairs. She leans in, her glasses catching the monitor's glow, and she watches the footage loop. Tyler's sharp profile, the casual tilt of his head, a man too comfortable in a place he shouldn't be. That's not a glitch, Sam, she adds, her words firm. That's a face, his face, and we've got him now. She straightens, her hands unclenching, and she glances at Abigail, who stands rigid by the wall, her breath hitching as the video plays again, a silent wound reopening. Abigail clutches the journal to her chest, her knuckles white against the leather, and she steps closer, her boots scuffing the gritty floor. That's him, she says, her voice low, breaking. Same walk, same damn smirk. I'd know it anywhere. She stares at the screen, her eyes glistening with unshed tears, and she presses a hand to her mouth, stifling a sob as the image freezes. Tyler, mid-step, caught in a moment of arrogance. He was in there with her, she whispers, her tone raw. With my girl, while I was reading to her, while Roy was carving. How long, Olivia? She turns, her gaze piercing and her hands tremble, the journal slipping slightly as her resolve hardens beneath the pain. Long enough, Olivia replies, her voice softening, and she reaches out, her hand hovering before resting on Abigail's shoulder, a steady anchor in the storm. This is it, Abigail. Proof he was here, proof he's not untouchable, she says, her tone lifting with quiet determination, and Sam's giving us the rope to hang him with. She nods toward the tech, who's still typing, his fingers steadier now, and she squeezes Abigail's shoulder, her eyes meeting hers with a promise unspoken. Across the state in a sleek Portland office, Tyler Grayson pours scotch into a crystal glass, his tailored suit pristine despite the late hour, and he paces by a floor-to-ceiling window, the city's lights glinting off his cufflinks. Clean it up, he barks into his phone, his voice clipped, commanding, "Every tape, every log, I don't care what it costs, just make it gone." He takes a sip, the liquid burning his throat, and he smirks, his reflection sharp in the glass as he glances at his lawyer, a wiry man scribbling notes at a mahogany desk. "They've got nothing," he says, his tone smug. "A jacket, a hunch? That's not evidence. That's desperation." He sets the glass down, the clink loud in the quiet, and he adjusts his tie, his fingers lingering as if savoring his own certainty. "They've got more than that," the lawyer replies, his voice low, cautious, and he looks up, his pen pausing mid-stroke. "Cops called an hour ago. Prints on the jacket match yours, and they're digging into security feeds," he explains, his eyes narrowing. "Someone's talking, Tyler, or someone's cracking." He taps the notepad, his fingers restless, and he leans back, his chair creaking under his slight frame. "You need to move. Canada, maybe, till we figure out how deep this goes," he adds, his tone urgent. "Because if they've got video, we're done." He scribbles again, his hand shaking slightly, and he watches Tyler, waiting for the mask to slip. Tyler laughs, a short, harsh sound, and he turns, his smirk widening as he picks up the scotch again. "Video?" he says, his voice dripping with disdain. "Those tapes are ash. I paid good money for that, and I don't pay for sloppy work." He takes another sip, his eyes glinting with defiance, and he steps closer, looming over the desk. "They're grasping, that's all. Abigail with her sad little stories, Roy with his mutt," he mocks, his tone sharp. "And that doctor, what's her name, Bennett? She's got nothing but a hunch and a stethoscope." He slams the glass down, the liquid sloshing, and he leans in, his voice dropping. "Let them try. I'll bury them in court, same as always," he says, his arrogance a shield, though his hand tightens around the glass, betraying a flicker of doubt. Back in the basement, Sam exhales, his shoulders slumping as he leans back, and he pushes his glasses up, his face pale but resolute. "It's saved," he says, his voice steady now. 2 minutes, clear as we'll get. Him going in, him coming out. He turns the monitor toward Olivia and Abigail, the footage looping again, and he wipes his hands on his jeans, his breath slowing. "That's all I could pull," he adds, quieter. "But it's enough, right?" He looks up, his eyes searching theirs, and he swallows, a kid stepping into a fight he didn't start. "More than enough," Olivia says, her tone firm, reassuring, and she claps Sam on the shoulder, her hand lingering as she nods. "You did good, Sam. Better than good," she tells him, her voice warm. "And now we take this upstairs, get Lara on it." She glances at Abigail, whose tears have spilled now, streaking her weathered cheeks, and she steps closer, her voice dropping. "He's not laughing anymore," she says, her words a vow. "Not after this." Abigail wipes her face with her sleeve, her breath shaky but fierce, and she grips the journal tighter, her eyes locked on Tyler's frozen smirk. "He'll pay," she says, her voice a promise, "for every second he took from her, for every damn day." She turns, her boots echoing as she heads for the stairs, and Olivia follows, Sam trailing behind, the video a torch lighting their path. In Portland, Tyler pours another drink, his hand steady again, and he smirks into the glass, oblivious to the web tightening around him, its threads spun from courage and grief. A faint breeze rustles the blinds in Alice's hospital room, carrying the scent of damp earth through the cracked window. Outside, the sky darkens, heavy with the promise of another Oregon storm. Abigail sits by Alice's bed, her fingers tracing the journal's spine, and she hums a tune, something old, something from her army days, her voice rough but steady as she watches her daughter's still face. "Been a long haul, hasn't it?" she murmurs, her tone soft, almost conversational, and she shifts in her chair, her knees creaking as she leans closer, the journal resting on her lap. "We got him though," she adds, her voice lifting slightly. "That bastard Tyler. Video, jacket, all of it." She pauses, her breath catching, and she brushes a strand of hair from Alice's forehead, her fingers lingering as if testing the weight of hope. "You just gotta come back to me now," she whispers, her words trembling. "Just open those eyes, baby." A groan escapes Alice's lips, faint but real, and Abigail freezes, her hand hovering, the journal slipping to the floor with a soft thud. "Alice?" she says, her voice breaking, and she leans in, her eyes wide as Alice's eyelids flutter, a slow, fragile motion against the pallor of her skin. "You're back," Abigail whispers, her tone raw, reverent, and she reaches for Alice's hand, her grip tight as the girl's eyes open, hazy, unfocused but alive. "Oh, God, you're back," she repeats, tears spilling now, and she presses Alice's fingers to her lips, her breath hitching as she fights to hold herself together. Alice blinks, her brows knitting, and she shifts, her hands fumbling toward her swollen belly, confusion clouding her gaze. What's this?" she croaks, her voice hoarse, unused, and she pushes at the blanket, her fingers trembling as they trace the curve, terror creeping into her eyes. "Mum?" she says, her tone rising, pleading, and she looks at Abigail, her breath quickening as the room spins into focus. The machines, the tubes, the years she can't grasp. "What happened to me?" she asks, her voice cracking, and she clutches her stomach, her nails digging in as if she could undo the truth beneath her skin. "You've been gone a while," Abigail says, her voice steadying though her hands shake, and she slides closer, her arm wrapping around Alice's shoulders, a shield against the flood. "6 years, honey. Accident took you from us. But you're here now," she explains, her tone gentle but firm, "and someone, hurt you while you were sleeping." She pauses, her jaw tightening, and she meets Alice's gaze, her eyes fierce with a mother's rage. "Tyler did this," she says, her voice a blade, "but we've got him. Cops are on him right now." In Portland, Tyler Grayson stands in his mansion study, the Scotch glass cool against his palm, and he smirks at the city skyline, his tailored suit catching the glow of a chandelier. "They're bluffing," he says, his voice smooth, dismissive, and he glances at his lawyer, who's packing a briefcase by the desk. "A grainy video? Prints? That's circumstantial at best," he adds, taking a sip. "And I've got enough to tie them up in court for years." He sets the glass down, his fingers drumming the marble counter, and he adjusts his cufflinks, his smirk unwavering as he imagines Abigail's face. Broken, powerless. "You sure about that?" the lawyer asks, his tone sharp, uneasy, and he snaps the briefcase shut, his eyes darting to the window as sirens wail in the distance. "They've got more than you think. Witnesses maybe, or that tech kid pulled something else," he warns, his voice rising. "And those sirens aren't for show, Tyler." He steps back, his hands flexing, and he grabs his coat, his movements jerky. "We need to go, now," he urges, his gaze flicking to the door, "before they—" His words cut off as the front door crashes open, boots thundering on marble, and Tyler freezes, the glass slipping from his hand, shattering in a spray of amber and crystal. "Tyler Grayson!" a voice bellows, authoritative, unyielding, and Lara Monroe strides in, her badge glinting as officers flank her, their hands on holsters. "You're under arrest. Assault, tampering, the works," she says, her tone clipped, precise, and she steps closer, her eyes locking onto his, a predator sizing up prey. "Thought you'd bury us, didn't you?" she adds, her voice low, cutting, "but that video's got your face all over it." She nods to an officer who cuffs Tyler's wrists, and she watches his smirk falter, a crack in the facade he's worn too long. Back in the room, Abigail grips Alice's hand, her tears falling freely now, and she picks up the journal from the floor, holding it like a weapon. "He's done, Alice," she says, her voice steady despite the sob in her throat. "Cops are hauling him in right now. You're safe." She brushes Alice's cheek, her touch tender, fierce, and she leans in, her forehead resting against her daughter's. "You don't have to understand it all yet," she whispers, her tone softening. "Just know I'm here, Roy's here." "Leo too." "Leo?" Alice says, her voice small, searching, and she shifts, her eyes darting as fragments of memory flicker, barking, a warm nose, a life before the dark. "He's still—" She trails off, her hand tightening on Abigail's, and she swallows, her breath ragged as terror ebbs into something softer, something like trust. "Mum, I don't know what's real," she admits, her tone breaking. "This, me. What do I do now?" She looks down, her hands trembling over her belly, and she shudders, a girl waking to a world she didn't choose. "You live," Abigail says, her voice firm, resolute, and she pulls Alice closer, her arms a fortress around her fragility. "You fight, like I taught you, like you always have," she continues, her tone lifting, "and we'll figure it out. step by step. She glances at the journal, then back to Alice, her eyes blazing with a promise. "He took enough. You don't let him take more," she adds, her voice a vow, "and I'll be right here every damn day." In Portland, Tyler stumbles as the cuffs click, his head high but his eyes wild, and he twists, his voice rising. "You've got nothing," he shouts, his tone desperate now. "I'll be out by morning. Watch me." The officers drag him toward the door, his polished shoes scuffing the marble, and Lara follows, her steps measured, a quiet triumph in her stride. Abigail lifts the journal, her voice a blade as she whispers to Alice, "You'll pay, Tyler, not with money, but with everything you've got left." The room hums, the storm gathering outside, and Alice's gasps fade into silence, a fragile strength blooming in the dark. If you were Alice, what would you do when you discovered this horrifying truth? Leave your thoughts in the comments. Inside, the air hangs heavy with the scent of polished wood and old grief, a quiet pulse threading through the walls. Alice Carter sits in the witness stand, her hands clasped tight in her lap, and she lifts her chin, her voice quavering but firm as she speaks into the microphone. "He told me I'd never get away," she says, her tone steady despite the tremor in her fingers. "Said it right to my face that night at the store. Said I'd regret walking out." She pauses, her eyes darting to the gallery where Roy grips Leo's leash, the dog's gaze fixed on her, and she draws a breath, her shoulders squaring as she continues. "I didn't think he'd follow through," she admits, her voice dropping. "But he did. Kept showing up, kept pushing, till that crash took everything." Her words falter, a crack in her resolve, and she grips the stand, her knuckles whitening as she forces herself to finish. Abigail stands by the rail, her hands steady now, and she steps forward when called, her boots clicking on the hardwood as she faces the judge. "6 years I waited," she says, her voice low, resonant. Sat by her bed, read her stories, watched her fade while he strutted around, free as you please. She glances at Tyler, cuffed in the dock, and her eyes harden, a soldier's steel shining through. "I kept her alive with hope," she adds, her tone lifting, "and now she's here, telling you what he did." "Don't you dare let him walk." She stops, her breath steady, and she nods to Alice, a silent pact renewed in the space between them. Roy leans forward in his seat, his fingers tight around Leo's leash, and he mutters under his breath, "You're doing it, kid," laying him out flat. He watches Alice, her fragility edged with strength, and he scratches Leo's ears, the dog whining softly as the gavel falls. Life without parole, a hammer striking stone. "About time," Roy says, his voice gruff, relieved, and he slumps back, his shoulders easing as the courtroom hums, justice settling like dust after a storm. Later, in Alice's hospital room, she lies propped against pillows, her hands stroking her swollen belly, and she glances at Leo curled beside her, his warmth a quiet comfort. "You stuck around, huh?" she says, her voice soft, teasing, and she looks at Abigail, who sits nearby, her coat draped over the chair. "Tell me that one again," she asks, her tone gentle. "About the kid in Nam, the one you pulled out of the mud." She shifts, her fingers lingering on her stomach, and she waits, her eyes searching her mother's face. Abigail leans in, her voice steady, rich with memory, and she begins, "Rain was coming down in sheets, and this boy, barely 18, was stuck, leg gone, screaming for his ma." She pauses, her gaze distant, and she smiles faintly, her hands folding in her lap. "I hauled him out, told him he'd see home again," she continues, "and he did, lived, 'cause we didn't quit." She meets Alice's eyes, her tone softening, and she reaches out, her hand resting on her daughter's. "You're tougher than he was," she says, her voice a vow, "and this one's got a chance 'cause of you." Alice's eyes glisten, a tear slipping free, and she strokes her belly again, her lips curving faintly as she whispers, "Hope." Her voice trembles, a fragile thread of light, and she grips Abigail's hand, her smile steadying as Leo nudges closer, a family forged in the quiet after the storm. The air hums with the faint buzz of bees, a quiet hymn to a spring day stretching towards summer. Alice Carter kneels in the sunlit field, her jeans patched at the knees, and she watches Hope toddle forward, her tiny hands clutching a worn tennis ball as she giggles, her voice a bright thread in the breeze. "Throw it, sweetie," Alice says, her tone soft, encouraging, and she steadies Hope's arm, her fingers warm against the girl's skin as the ball arcs clumsily toward Leo, who bounds after it, his tail wagging like a metronome. "He's still got it," she adds, her voice lifting with a laugh, and she brushes a strand of hair from her face, her eyes crinkling as she tracks the dog's joyful leaps, a sight that stitches something broken back together. "You think he'd ever slow down?" Roy calls from a few yards away, his voice gruff but warm, and he swings a hammer, driving a wooden sign into the earth, the words Carter Rescue Center etched deep in the grain. He steps back, wiping sweat from his brow, and he rests the hammer against his shoulder, his gaze settling on Hope, then Alice, a quiet pride softening the lines of his face. "Built this for you," he says, his tone steady. "Took a year, but it's yours and hers. And wow." He nods toward the barn in the distance, its red paint fresh against the green, and he scratches his neck, his hands rough from months of work, a labor of love he'd never call by name. "He's a stubborn one," Alice replies, her voice teasing but fond, and she rises, dusting grass from her knees as she scoops Hope into her arms, the girl's laughter bubbling against her chest. "Wouldn't have it any other way, though," she adds, her tone softening. "You stuck around when I couldn't. Kept this dream alive." She shifts Hope to her hip, her eyes meeting Roy's, and she smiles, faint but real, a thank you woven into the curve of her lip. "What do we do with all these dogs now?" she asks, her voice lifting. "Got a dozen already? Think we can handle it?" "We'll manage," Roy says, his voice firm, reassuring, and he taps the sign with his knuckles, the sound solid, grounding. "You've got a knack for saving things. Always did," he continues, his tone dipping into memory, "and I'm not half bad at fixing what's broke." He glances at the barn, where a scruffy mutt pokes its head out, barking at the wind, and he chuckles, low and easy, a sound that's rare but fits the day. "Besides," he adds, quieter now, "Hope's got your spirit. She'll keep us on our toes." From the porch of the old farmhouse, Abigail leans on her cane, its tip tapping softly against the weathered wood, and she watches them, her grey hair catching the sunlight, a rare smile softening the edges of her face. "She's growing fast," she says, her voice carrying across the yard. "Too fast. Reminds me of you, running wild out there." She shifts her weight, her cane steadying her, and she tilts her head, her eyes tracing Hope's clumsy steps, then Alice's careful ones, a mother's gaze that's seen too much but still finds light. "You did good with that name," she adds, her tone warm. "Hope fits her. Fits this." "Had to," Alice replies, her voice steady, reflective, and she walks toward the porch, Hope bouncing in her arms as she climbs the steps. "Couldn't let him name her," she says, nodding toward Roy. "Would have ended up with something like mutt or scrap, no offense." She sets Hope down, the girl scampering to Abigail's feet, and she brushes her daughter's hair, her fingers lingering as she smooths the tangles, a quiet strength in her touch. "She's my second chance," she adds, softer now, "and I'm not wasting it. Not on him, not on anything." Abigail reaches down, her hand trembling slightly, and she cups Hope's chin, her thumb brushing the girl's cheek as she smiles, a rare crack in her soldier's armor. "Second chances don't come cheap," she says, her voice low, wise. "Fought for mine in the war, lost plenty to get it." She straightens, her cane tapping once, and she looks at Alice, her eyes glistening but fierce. "You're stronger than I was," she continues, her tone lifting. "Took what he threw at you and built this. Damn proud of that." She nods toward the field where Leo chases another ball, and she exhales, long and slow, a release of years she's carried alone. Roy joins them, his boots heavy on the steps, and he leans against the railing, his hammer resting by his side as he watches the dogs in the distance. "Place is alive now," he says, his voice rough but content, barking, running, everything you wanted back then. He glances at Alice, his eyes softening, and he shifts his weight, his hands folding over the rail. "Thought we'd lost it. Lost you," he admits, quieter. "But you pulled through and here we are." He pauses, his gaze drifting to Hope, and he smiles, faint but real. She's got a hell of a mum, he adds, his tone steady, and a hell of a crew. Couldn't do it without you, Alice says, her voice firm, grateful, and she sits beside Abigail, her hand resting on Hope's head as the girl babbles, her tiny voice weaving through the wind. Both of you kept me going, even when I didn't know it, she continues, her tone dipping into memory. And now I've got her. This place feels right finally. She looks out, her eyes tracing the barn, the dogs, the life she's reclaimed, and she brushes a tear away, her fingers steady despite the ache beneath. Abigail taps her cane again, her smile widening, and she rests a hand on Alice's shoulder, her touch a lifeline forged in fire. Took a war to teach me peace, she says, her voice soft, reflective. But you found it here with them. She nods toward Hope, then Roy, and she leans back, her cane still as the barking carries on, a chorus of new lives saved. Roy grunts, a sound of agreement, and he picks up his hammer, twirling it once before setting it down. Long as Leo's chasing balls, we're good, he says, his tone light, grounding. And long as you're here, we've got plenty to fight for. He steps off the porch, heading toward the barn, and Alice watches, Hope's laughter ringing in her ears, a quiet strength blooming in her chest. The wind carries the sound of barking dogs, a melody of renewal, and Alice brushes Hope's hair again, her fingers lingering, a mother's promise in every stroke. If this movie has touched your heart, leave a like and don't forget to subscribe to the channel. Join us in discovering more profound and meaningful stories. Don't keep the story to yourself. Share it with your friends to spread your emotions and connect souls. We also want to hear your own thoughts in the comments section. Each of your shares will be a bridge to build a close-knit community where we can find empathy together. The most fascinating stories are still waiting for you ahead. Follow me so you don't miss any moment. See you in the next video.